Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Suburban Proletarian. My name is Greg, and today I want to take a look at a really unusual digital watch from Casio. Unfortunately, it's not from Casio anymore. It's been recently discontinued, but just in the last couple of years. Along with another model, or maybe discontinued, I'm not sure. I'll talk about that in a minute. But what makes it really unusual is the fact that this is a solar-powered watch from Casio. And some of you are probably going, what are you talking about? Casio has tons of tough solar models. That is true. But the tough solar models are not really solar-powered watches. They are battery-powered watches, quite conventional battery-powered watches, with a built-in solar charging system, which is really actually quite weak, and it takes a long time to charge the battery up. Once the battery's charged up, if it gets a normal amount of light, the charging system is generally enough to keep the battery topped up, and they have little power reserve indicators and everything on them. But really the charging system and the operating module are, I think, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they're completely separate. This watch is solar powered in the same way that a Casio pocket calculator would be solar powered. It has a rather large cell on there, and that powers the watch on a regular basis. And that makes it relatively unusual. The thing about this watch that I find so confounding, and there's very little information out there on most models of digital watch, there's zero information that I can find on this watch, is what the purpose was behind it. It was really pretty weird, and we'll get into that a little bit on the tabletop. It doesn't look like something that Casio would have. Maybe they did. I mean, it was certainly available on the commercial market, but it doesn't look like the type of thing Casio engineers would have designed for the commercial market. It seems institutional to me. It seems like something that was created to fulfill the needs of some institution or government agency or whatever. I don't know. It is fun to speculate, however. I love doing that. So anyway, there was a second model, and in the last video I said this one's not available anymore, but the other one is. That other model I was talking about was the AL190W. Now, I said in my last video that that one was still available because I had seen it in Casio's current online catalog. The funny thing is, the HDD-S100 is also in Casio's current online catalog, but both watches are clearly discontinued. Every place that had listed either of those for sale, they're not in stock. They're not expected to be in stock. I think a couple of websites say it's been discontinued by the manufacturer. They do both still appear in Casio's catalog, however. So I don't know, maybe someday. And they're both part of Casio's Classic series. Casio has been pulling stuff out of retirement and popping it up every once in a while. So maybe they'll reappear. But right now, they are totally unavailable on a retail level. And what's really interesting is that both the HDD-S100 and the AL190W, which is basically the same module, it's just in a scaled down, less water resistant case. It's only water resistant to 50 meters. But both of those are not even available on the secondhand market. I couldn't find an example of either one on eBay. Now, they're not rare watches. I think both this and the AL190W were made in large numbers, but where they have all gone, I have no idea, especially since they were both clearly designed to be sort of everlasting watches. Maybe people are just holding on to them. Anyway, I do have one right here. This is the HDD-S100 again. This is by far the more interesting of the two, and let's go over and check it out on the tabletop. All right, guys, so here is the Casio HDD-S100, and it should be immediately apparent that it is solar powered. You can see a large photovoltaic cell right here. But as I've already alluded to, this watch is a little bit weird. Actually, it's a little bit weird in several different ways, but it's a little bit weird primarily in how the power delivery system works. So in order for me to explain that weirdness, let me just set this aside for the moment, and we will take a look at a much more conventional solar watch from Casio. This is a G-Shock. It is in fact the G2310R G-Shock from Casio. And I've had a number of Casio solar watches cross my desk over the years. This one's in my personal, wearing rotation. It's my personal collection, but I've bought and sold a whole pile of other Casio Tough solar watches. I've worn, to a certain extent, other Casio Tough solar watches. And you can see it says right here, Tough Solar. So if it features a conventional solar system, most Casio watches are going to be labeled Tough Solar. And this is fairly conventional from a modern perspective. This watch works in much the same way that most solar-powered watches from other manufacturers and from Casio work. And when you first look at it, it's not immediately apparent where the photovoltaic cell is. And that's because it doesn't have to be very large. And Casio has artfully concealed it. It actually exists in all of this black space around the dial, under the crystal, surrounding the various LCD displays. And they're able to make it small and unobtrusive and almost invisible because it doesn't have to do a whole lot. This watch is running off of a battery, just like this non-solar watch is, and this non-solar watch is, and this digital caliper is. They all run off of batteries, and this is really no different. And the battery that's in this watch, it won't run the watch for 2 or 3 or 4 years like the battery in this watch or the battery in this watch, but it will run the watch for about 6 months, and it'll allow you to use the light. There's an electroluminescent light in there. I don't know if you can see it very well, that you can activate by pushing this button. And it's got a bunch of alarms. It can do a lot of energy-intensive things. And as long as it gets exposed to regular sunlight, like it's not in a cave or in the back of a desk drawer for a year, the tiny little photovoltaic cells around the outside of the display generate plenty of power to keep the battery topped up. And you can see there's a sort of power reserve indicator here. It's right now indicating that the battery is fully charged. It says high there, and there's medium, and there's low. And if it starts moving down through this bottom scale, I better get this thing out in the sun a bit more and get the battery charged up. But it can work for about 6 months in the dark, and it is running more or less off of a conventional battery. It's a rechargeable battery, so it's a little bit different than the batteries in these watches, but it's essentially a conventional battery. Now, let us take a look at the HDD-S100. And the charging system, or I should say the power delivery system in this, is much, much different than in a conventional Casio Tough Solar watch. As a matter of fact, I mentioned before, it actually has a lot more in common with the power delivery system in this Casio desk calculator, or actually it's a pocket calculator, but you've got a large photovoltaic cell, very similar to the large photovoltaic cell on this calculator, and it is delivering power to the watch in real time. It is not just charging a battery inside the watch. It is feeding electricity directly to the display all the time, just like this calculator does. But when I cover up the photo cell on the calculator, eventually the display fades out completely and it will die. And then it comes right back on again as soon as you expose it to light. If I cover up the photoelectric panel on the watch, it does not die. And that is because there is an alternate form of energy storage device in here called a capacitor. It's not a battery. It's a small electronic device, and I don't want to get into the science behind it, but it can store a small charge of energy, which is enough to not only keep the module, the timekeeping module inside the watch working and keeping time, but also it can power the display for about 2 weeks. And you might say to yourself, well, what the heck is the advantage? And I'm not really sure about that. I mean, they didn't make very many of these watches. There was this, there was the, as I stated earlier, the AL190, which was a somewhat scaled down version of this watch. Only 2 models that I'm aware of that used this system, at least in recent years. Obviously, these are much more popular. The big advantage, I would say use advantage of this watch over this watch, the only real use advantage, other than maybe absolute longevity, is the fact that you can charge this watch up in about an hour to an hour and a half in direct sunlight. This watch, on the other hand, if you get it shipped, and I've had them come in already where the battery indicator was on low, you'd really have to leave this on a windowsill in more or less direct sunlight for 2 to 3 days to get the charge indicator all the way up to the top. And if you just strap it on your wrist right away and start wearing it normally, it might take a week or 2 weeks for the charge indicator to get all the way up to the top. Now, again, it'll hold a charge for 6 months. This only holds a charge for about 14 days, but as long as it's getting regular sunlight, it can charge very quickly. And the thinking behind this is that it never has to have the battery replaced. I've never had the battery go bad in a Casio Tough Solar, but it is an eventuality. If you can get the rest of the watch to last for 15 or 20 or 30 years, eventually that battery is going to go bad. Now, capacitors are a completely different story. In theory, ostensibly, because of the very small amount of current that's going around and around and around inside this watch, there is the possibility that the capacitor inside this watch could last indefinitely. It can continue to get recharged and recharged and recharged, and potentially this watch could essentially run forever as long as it was exposed to sunlight every once in a while. What the huge advantage of that is, I really could not tell you. But that's the big difference between this and that. And I don't understand why this watch was designed the way it was. I mean, again, potentially Casio engineers just said, hey, do you think we can make a thing? And then they went and made a thing. But it really has the smack of bureaucracy to my eye. It looks like something that was designed at the behest of some sort of an agency or institution that wanted a watch that was essentially everlasting. I don't know if it was for isolating researchers in the middle of the Sahara Desert. It would have to be someplace that gets a lot of sun. But what the ultimate goal behind this watch was, I don't really know. So let's take a little bit better look at what the watch is made up of. When you look at it, right off the bat, it looks like a 4-button, essentially pretty conventional 4-button Casio watch. But it is in fact a 3-button Casio watch. This is a phantom or false button here, just to, I think, maintain the symmetry of the watch. Although this watch was definitely designed for function and not style, there are very few concessions to appearance made in the design of this watch. Aside from the button design, the overall layout of the watch is very G-Shocky, and actually the design, the construction of the watch is sort of G-Shocky. It does feature 200 meters of water resistance. It's a very large, chunky watch. It has a case diameter including the buttons, of just over 46 millimeters. The case length is just about 50 millimeters. The height of the case is from the back of the case to the top of the bezel ring is 12.3 millimeters, so fairly thick, but not super thick. So it's a big, chunky watch. But functionally, the inside of it, as the 3-button layout would suggest, it's very much more like the very familiar layout of the Casio F91W, which has a little LED light in there, and it basically has one mode button which just toggles through the various modes to alarm, stopwatch, and then to a setting mode. And so there's no adjustment button to get into setting. You just toggle through to get to the setting mode, and you can change between 12-hour and 24-hour layout by pushing the lower right button. We're all very familiar with that watch. Well, this is basically a scaled up version of that, with the exception of the fact that it has an unusual power delivery system. It's pretty much like an F91W, except that it has a few extra features and one fewer feature, which I don't understand. First of all, the one fewer feature is there is no light button. There's no light in this watch. When it's dark, if you don't have a flashlight or you can't flip on the lights, you're not going to see what time it is on this watch. And that, of course, is a concession to power conservation. That little tiny capacitor inside the watch just doesn't have enough storage capacity to continually operate a light. Lights are fairly energy intensive. However, when we start looking at the other features, it does toggle back and forth between 12 and 24-hour time using exactly the same button. We've got a select button here instead of a light button, but it does some of the same features. But when we start toggling through the modes, we'll see that this does have a few more features than the F91W. Immediately we go into alarm mode, which is surprising that this has an hourly chime and an alarm, because those are also very energy intensive. And it seems like if you were going to omit the light, you would also omit the alarm. But the weird thing is, not only does it have an alarm, it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 alarms, which is crazy. I mean, this seems like a watch that's designed for somebody living on a desert island somewhere, where they have no access to watch service or batteries or anything like that. But on the other hand, I can't really imagine a scenario where someone stranded on a desert island would need 5 alarms a day. Although I guess there are certain military applications. If you had to make radio checks at normal intervals, maybe an alarm would be helpful. I mentioned researchers earlier, out in the middle of the desert or something. I guess there's a chance that they might have timed experiments that need to be checked on a regular intervals. So, I mean, who knows? This watch does seem very institutional to me. So we've already covered the alarm. There's also a conventional stopwatch, which the F91W does have. And it's got a 24-hour countdown timer. And somebody just started running the vacuum cleaner downstairs. Hopefully that's not too terribly intrusive in the sound quality of the video. And then it toggles right into the setting mode. So it's a pretty basic watch. It's kind of weird, and it's not available anymore. And I probably would have talked on about it a little bit longer. I would have compared some of the design with this DW290, which is another sort of weird Casio that I'd like to review up in an upcoming video, but because someone's running a vacuum cleaner downstairs, we're going to skip the rest of the tabletop and go right to the wrap-up. And so, while it is certainly unusual and quirky, and it lacks certain features that we've come to expect from digital watches, like any type of illumination at night, I still find the HDD-S100 a profoundly interesting and really kind of cool watch. Again, they are very, very scarce apparently at the moment, even on the secondhand market. I was very fortunate to get the loan of this one from my dad. Thanks a lot, Dad. What the cause is for that scarcity, I don't know. I don't know if it's people just holding on to their watches because they are so unavailable. They certainly weren't rare in production. Maybe it's the case that the capacitors started failing and they don't end up being as everlasting as they appear to have been designed to be. That was a failing, if I recall correctly, of early Seiko solar watches. I had a Seiko solar watch that I bought about 20 years ago. It was right around the turn of this century, 1999, 2000 maybe, that was solar powered, but it ran off of a capacitor. And if I recall correctly, Seiko's capacitors, I don't know if Seiko Epson was making their own capacitors or if they were buying their capacitors from a third-party source. But those capacitors started failing at an unacceptably high rate when the watches weren't very old. And of course, they had all of these proclamations on the case back, do not open, never need service, blah, blah, blah. And the watches were dying in 2 or 3 years. And so eventually, Seiko ended up going to a solar charging system that was much more like Casio's Tough Solar, as in the G-Shock we looked at earlier, where you have a little solar charging system that's worked into the dial and it feeds electricity into a battery and then the battery powers the watch. So maybe that's what happened with these Casio capacitor powered watches. Maybe the capacitors have started going bad. I don't know. This one's still working great, and again, I'm very glad to have had it to take a look at. I hope that some of you are glad to have watched this video. If you are, please consider subscribing to the channel. It goes a long way to help keep me right here on the tube. If you're already a subscriber, like, share, tell your friends, all of those things make me feel great, and they go a long way to help keep me here on the air. Stay safe, wash your hands, and when I post new content to the channel, I hope to see each of you here then. Later, guys!